teammate. Welcome, everyone. Not see. No, okay, won't worry about it. I assume everyone's okay. Good afternoon. Welcome. This is Indigenous storytelling, myths, or something else. So it's something that's near and dear to my heart, actually, and I will explain to you guys why in just a little bit. This is brought to you by ARPDC, the Alberta Regional Professional Development Consortia, which is funded through Learn Alberta. And I actually belong to ERLC. However, I live in Calgary, just to make things a little complicated. So Tanse, where do you live? If you know which treaty land you are living by or on, or which area your school is at closest to a settlement, or if I know there's 3 school divisions in Calgary that are not, or sorry, rather in Alberta, that are not close to any treaty land or specifically on treaty land. And if that is the case, you can always put the name of the individuals, the culture, the people that were displaced on that land. You want to pop that into the chat. Yeah, it's funny that I'm not getting any notifications. I had to actually click on the chat to get that. It's very frustrating. Oh, thank you. Sounded good, Dakota. Thank you. You can hear me. Awesome. Treaty 7. Oh, so we've got some more Treaty 7 people here. Treaty 6, Treaty 8. Northern Lakes College is here. Welcome. Respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 8 territory, Métis Nation of Alberta Districts 13 through 15 and 20 through 22, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis peoples. We recognize the 15 First Nations for Métis Nation settlements located through our service region. Wow, you have a large service region. Oh my goodness. Masquatchis, or I heard somebody say the other day Musquatchis, so I hope I'm saying it the right way because I'm just learning Cree now. More treaty. Yeah, awesome, guys. Thank you from all over the place. That's awesome. Amazing. And I do live on Treaty 7 land, which is the ancestral home of the Blackfoot people here. There are also Dene people at Tsuut'ina, and of course I belong to Métis Nation District 5, and there's also 6 here as well. That was just changed through our last elections. All of these individuals here have contributed to the shaping of Alberta and Canada. I do thank the Blackfoot people for allowing me to live on their land and sharing it. I grew up in Treaty 1 land, and that sounds like it would be like Disneyland. It's not. Treaty 1 land area. Sorry, it sounded very odd to say like that. And the Red River settlement. I've never said it like that before. So just, I know I saw some names on there. I believe that you've attended some of my sessions before, but I do, by way of ARPDC, we always want to recognize that there are people that are not necessarily people that have attended before. So I'll give you some of my background information, just explaining, especially in this particular area with First Nations, Métis and Inuit, you know, what informs my practice, why I'm doing this work. So first of all, I am Tammy Johnson, and under ARPDC, we're called Designers of Professional Learning, which is a very apt title that was given to all of our contractors this last year. Because besides doing these online presentations in professional development for teachers, which has become very useful, one of good things that came out of the whole COVID pandemic was that a lot of resources became available online that were not otherwise available before, and a lot of our PD went online, so teachers have this as a more accessible way of getting their information, which is really great. I do go across the province and go to different regions and do presentations and workshops in individual schools and school divisions, and as well as myself work on some curriculum areas, particularly the focus currently is on the new curriculum with other groups. So for instance, next week, I don't know if it's next week, but regardless, in December, I'll be working with the math team and showing them how I present information in regard to implementing Indigenous ways of knowing into the math curriculum in different ways for teachers so that they can share that as well and possibly implement some of that within their work that they do as well, so it informs them, so they're infusing that information there because it's really important. As I said, I am Red River Métis, which was historically, I'm from what was called the Red River Settlement, and that is a legal title that was given to the area of Manitoba that our people were living originally, and that was once the government of Canada, which was Upper and Lower Canada, took over the area called Manitoba, and that was after the execution of Louis Riel. So yeah, we won't get into the whole history there. It's not a history lesson on the Métis, but yeah, so that's not what we necessarily called it, but that's what it was referred to when they started handing out script and all that. If you are Indigenous or you know Indigenous peoples, you know that there's two ways we identify ourselves when we talk to each other. The first one we ask is, what's your name and basically where you're from. So we want to know your people and your land. So for the Métis, we are very, very interconnected through kinship, through land ownership, living beside each other, growing up together, having fought battles together, those sorts of things. So there's lots of different connections. I said on the weekend, I was at a sweat on Sunday with I brought a lady that I know just met that's Métis, and she's also from Manitoba. So we're definitely found a connection there where we're related. But a young woman that volunteers with AIM, so American Indian Movement, with our group sometimes, and she was there, and she's also Métis, and she said she actually was through my hometown, which is Selkirk, Manitoba, north of Winnipeg, and they'd stayed there. And I jokingly said, of course, because honestly, I mean, I love where I come from, but it's not the most wonderful place necessarily. I wouldn't look at it as a destination to go, on a holiday. And she said that she had family there actually that was buried in one of the church graveyards. And so I said to her, St. Andrew's Anglican Church, and she said yes. Nice. And she told me the last name Pruden, and I said, yep, we're related. We're definitely related. So pretty much all of us, once we start talking, we it might be a distant cousin, but we're all somehow related, interestingly enough. And I've known this girl for about a year now. My family main surname, so the big four, were Mowat. My mom's Mowat, that's her maiden name. McDonald, Mackay, and Beaudry. Mackay, you'd know from across Alberta as well, in Saskatchewan, and Beaudry's are French Métis voyageur family from Alberta, northern Alberta. And that picture there is of my great-grandfather. My family did spend time in Alberta. They were at Fort Edmonton and at Fort Saskatchewan. They had land in both of those places. My great-grandpa there's a school named after him in Fort Saskatchewan. James Millwood Elementary. Millwood Park is right beside it, and that's named after my family. And then in Edmonton, there's James Millwood Trail, spelled with two T's. And I'm not going to get into the whole how the English didn't understand the Scottish. Anyway, the picture beside that one of him is of his 4 surviving children. My grandpa is the middle boy. I believe that picture to be probably around 1916, because I think my grandpa was about 6 years old there. That's his 2 brothers, Oliver and Stanley, and my great aunt Tassie in her Sunday best there. They're all dressed in World War I type outfits. I imagine that's what was available to people then. And the picture of my great grandpa, I think, is late 1800s. So as I said, I'm from Manitoba. I started working in the core area of Winnipeg when I first started teaching and graduated from University of Winnipeg, and immediately was working with a lot of Indigenous students, particularly at that time. A lot had come from the reserves. If you think things are bad economically now, it's nothing compared to what was happening then. And so people were, desperate to try to get jobs, and they're coming off the reserves to work. And these kids, it was culture shock, and language, their language was totally different. And so they would bring me in as the only Indigenous teacher in the school to work with the kids, especially the girls, who are very, very, very shy. So that's how it kind of started. But then a couple of years ago, I took a contract with KTCA, or Kataskanau Tribal Council, at Red Earth Creek through an online school, Ignite, and took their grade 7 to 9 outreach program. And it was based on the season, so fall, winter, spring, and actually trying to combine all the 3 grades so they could work together. So trying to find commonalities within all the curriculum to do that, but decolonized it for their particular cultures, indigenized it, added land-based learning, and Cree language. Cree language I'm learning now. So I would just put in references at that point, but they took that work, the elders took it, and they were very pleased with what I did. So finding out that growing up the way I did, not realizing all the things I had actually learned, because you don't think about it, right? It's just the way you grow up, had been very beneficial to me in the long run. But then I was encouraged, actually told they weren't going to hire me at that school online to teach because they thought that this is the work I should be doing. To which I responded, well, that's really awesome, but I need to have a job and make a living. So I actually did take a leap of faith. I contracted out myself. It's been difficult at times, but it's been very rewarding, and I'm finding that the work is growing. My main aim with working here with ARPDC and ERLC is to help other educators, especially non-Indigenous ones, to be able to do this work that's especially been brought into the curriculum and you're being told you have to do it anyway, but not really giving any support in doing that. And I know that there's Indigenous consultants and school divisions and such, but they're usually so overwhelmed with the amount of help that teachers need and try to make connections with the community, all those things you probably know about, that it really leaves very little time for them to do this kind of work. So that is my kind of drive in doing this, is I really want this work to be out there. I want teachers to be feeling comfortable, that they're feeling like they're respecting Indigenous cultures, and that they, are not appropriating and that sort of thing. Because I know that those are all concerns, and you wouldn't be here most likely if you weren't interested in that, if you weren't concerned about that. So I thank you for being here. So with that, I'm going to go on and just show you one thing on ARPDC that's really important. If you haven't used the ARPDC website, and I find that a lot of educators, can't speak educators, actually don't know that this is here. I'm trying to speak with my teacher voice, and it's very difficult. I've told the more I learn Cree, the more my Manitoba accent comes out by my son. So I'm trying to be careful and speak clearly. So bear with me. Empowering the Spirit is a website. I think it's an amazing website. There's so many resources on here. So if you haven't checked it out, you've probably seen resources from it. But if you haven't checked it out, please do so, because there's so much stuff on here. It's layers and layers and layers once you start getting into it. And I always point out, and I always say this if you've been here before, my favorite is Orange Shirt Day and Beyond, because it's got some really cool resources that are just readily available for teachers. Under teaching tools, there. Whoops. If I go there, I'm not going to because it'll take too much time. But there's, for instance, level and divisions of things like sharing circles or Orange Shirt Day posters, that sort of thing. So there's things already made in there for you guys. And this is all done by Alberta teachers for Alberta teachers. So, I really encourage you to take a peek. And then the other part of it is the actual search engine on the website. So you can go find resources by focus. And you also know at the top, you can go by your TQS or LQS as well. There's that too. So, but I'm going to go to focus. And I could go down because there's tons of stuff, but I'm going to go to First Nations, Métis and Inuit, of course. And so it comes up with all the resources that are available. Apologize, I'm not bored with you. I just didn't sleep very well. Some things you may notice if you've been a teacher for a while that you may have seen in schools in a paper resource. For instance, Our Way is a Valid Way. The Education is Our Buffalo. I know I've had physical copies of that at different times. And then Weaving Ways is on here as well. And there's a link to Empowering the Spirit. You can also search by audience. So you can look at, what is it you're wanting. You can go by level, or you can also look at what type of resources there. So just always a good idea, start there. If you're not sure where to go at first and you don't have all the resources that you want, for sure, take a peek there. Like I said, I will try to keep an eye on the chat. It wasn't popping up as soon as you guys put stuff in there, but I will occasionally take a peek just in case somebody asks a question. Even if I don't notice, feel free to interrupt me through audio. It's okay if you do that. I'm going to start with this. So protocols. So I don't know if everybody understands what a protocol is. I realized this the other day when I was doing a presentation, actually in Tabor, and I was talking to the teachers about this, and I was talking about protocols, and then I saw a couple of them with their faces looked kind of funny, and I was like, okay, does anybody actually understand what protocols mean in terms of Indigenous culture? And a couple of them actually said, like, they gave me some ideas and they were pretty close. They're like, I think it's this. And I said, okay, well, yeah, you're pretty close. And now basically a protocol is anytime that you enter into a space, especially with elders or knowledge keepers, or where there's a ceremony or a community's gathered, there are protocols for behavior. And what that means is, we don't call them rules because they're not rules. They're basically, it's an agreement more than anything else. You enter into that situation understanding that if you're going to work in this area with these people, that there are things that you need to do to be respectful, basically. So for storytelling, there are protocols to follow. So meaning, let's, for instance, like if you're in a sharing circle, talk a little bit more about this at some different points in the presentation, but, or if you're just listening to an elder speak, of course, we don't interrupt elders. We don't ask them questions to question what they're talking about particularly. We might say, oh, I didn't hear that, sorry, could you repeat that? Or I didn't catch that thing, or what, like that sort of thing. Yes, but we don't question them because that's rude. It's saying that you're questioning their actual information that they're giving you, or you're questioning their ability to do what they're saying they're doing. So it's just really disrespectful. But in terms of being teachers, and if you want that information, and let's say you're at some event and you hear a story and you think, oh, I would love to tell this in my classroom, right? And you're writing down things or you're recording or whatever. Well, first of all, you need to check if you can record things, because there are some things you can and some things you can't. Generally, when it's in public, the person will tell you first. And so just in case you walk into something and you're partway through and you haven't got that information, they will usually tell you before telling a story or singing a song, with drumming or just singing, or before a dance is performed, whatever, if you are allowed to record that particular one or not. There's a few reasons for that I can get into later. But you always want to ask permission before you share that story. It's really important to ask that. It's just a courtesy. A lot of the time, especially if it's done in public and they have said you can record it or whatever, it's not usually an issue to do that. But it's always just a good idea to do that out of courtesy. And often, especially if you want to share something that's like a cultural story and that person is allowing you to do that, you might want to offer them tobacco as well. Anyways, just want to make this clear before I go on with everything else. Really important in Indigenous culture as well, there's no asking for forgiveness after the fact. So, that whole idea of I will go ahead and do it and then beg for forgiveness later does not exist. It's very, very rude and very disrespectful. So I always tell people, if you're unsure at any time, just ask. It's better to do that. The person would rather have you ask them than to just go ahead and do something and then it be very rude. And then the other part of it to understand as well, that there are stories that may be considered sacred for a particular family or clan. Don't forget that some of these stories may in fact be thousands of years old. We don't know how old some of them are. Métis stories are not, they're hundreds of years old for sure, but if we've got stories from our cousins, like our Cree cousins or our Ojibwe cousins, those would be also ones that were passed down and could perhaps be thousands of years old as well. Also, just so you understand, everything that's done is sacred in some sense. It's spiritual. So a story could also be considered to be medicine. And that's where it shouldn't be shared with just anyone. Somebody may have been given permission or shared that story to be able to do that. And as I said, there's spiritual beliefs that are there to inform the stories as well. There is nothing that's done in traditional culture that doesn't have a spiritual aspect to it. So that's really important to understand. And we're talking traditional culture, right? Plenty of Indigenous people are living colonized lives. The majority of us have, lived the regular same kind of lives as everybody else. Not everyone practices traditional spiritualism either. So that's, and that's something that we're all learning, those of us who didn't grow up with it. Like I'm learning that. I know a lot of my friends are learning that too. But it's really important to understand that everything has a spirit, everything. Animism exists in our culture. It just does. Okay. So I'm going to put that out there. The ancestors exist in spirit form and they watch over us. That is something we believe, that are traditional practitioners. I'm just saying. Medicine exists in various forms. It can be the plants, the drum, the rattle, anything that's created through prayer and blessing, anything. We say, like when a child is in the room and they laugh and they're playing, we say that's good medicine. The children being there, or if they come into the spot lodge and they sing with us and do that, that's good medicine. So, there's good and bad medicine. But particular things, like for instance, just to explain, when you make a drum, you smudge and you pray over the hide before you use it, because that's the animal and you're thanking the animal. Well, the animal was thanked before it was hunted, hopefully. And then when you actually make the drum and you put it together and before you play it, you also smudge again to respect that animal. And every time before you play in a ceremony or any place else, you smudge that. Before I go into a sweat lodge, I smudge my drum and my drumstick. I smudge all the things I'm going to take in with me, but particularly that if I go to my drumming circle on Thursday night, I smudge my drum and my rattle before I use them. So it's just really important to understand that, and it's out of respect for the animal and to clear any negative energy. And then also what is spoken comes into existence. So that's really important to understand as well. So stories are, you have to be careful what you say and do when you're telling stories for us, because if I'm saying, let's say I say anything negative about myself or my friends do about themselves, we'll stop each other and say, hey, what are you doing? Right? You don't put that out there. That's not cool. Because what you tell yourself, becomes true. That in Western culture, that's self-fulfilling prophecy, right? What you tell yourself, your brain recognizes and says, okay, that's what you're doing. But if you say anything negative about somebody else, that's considered bad medicine as well. It's going to come back to you, and it's also going to put that onto that other person. So you have to be really careful. So I know some of these things might sound strange to you guys, but this is the truth. So what we believe. And then everything created has a story as well, right? Everything. So the drum I make, everything that I have, there's a story behind it. And so animism, if you're not aware of what animism is particularly, and to understand it, is the belief that all animate and inanimate objects have a spirit, soul, or consciousness. It's really important to understand that, right? So that can include many things, right? Animals, rivers, mountains, the sun, the moon, the stars, rocks, everything. Like we call the rocks for the sweat lodge, they're the kokum and the mushrooms, right? The grandmothers and the grandfathers. We bring them in. They carry the knowledge of this planet within them, and the idea that we're all made. In First Nations people have been saying since the beginning of time that they were from the stars, and we know, hey, Neil deGrasse Tyson has said that we all come from the stars, right? Because from the Big Bang, we all contain those pieces of the stars that are within us, and the vitamins that I take every night before bed and contain all those same things that are in the stars, that are in the rocks, that are on the planet everywhere, right? So in that sense, we are all interrelated that way, right? And so in a story, just so you understand, so animism occurs a lot in stories for Indigenous people. You'd probably come across this a lot, right? So each entity is considered to be a spirit that can either help or hurt humans, right? So you'll know, and I'll get into the whole book tricksters and stuff like that, so we'll talk about that. So animists are expected to satisfy the demands of these spirits. So when they come to them in the stories, right, they have to satisfy them. So often they'll offer sacrifices, dedicate prayers or dances, anything like that, in an act of devotion towards these spirits. They're not worshiping them. Anyways, just to give you an idea behind the idea of what's in some of the stories. I'm not saying anybody has to believe this outside of here. This is just the way it is. So if I took the idea of First Nations, Métis and Inuit storytelling, if we look at what is kind of the common thread, it varies amongst groups, obviously, right? But all groups of Indigenous people includes stories about the land, the environment, and contact with other people that affects the stories. Or like in the case of animals that are inhabiting, like have a spirit inhabit them, come to them, right? So you're probably more aware, like I said, the First Nations and Inuit stories, because those are definitely out there. I am going to touch on a little bit about Métis stories as well, because I am Métis, and so you can understand that. We have our own style of storytelling, right? A combination of our cultures, First Nations, usually, like I said, not always just, but generally Korean and Ojibwe from Manitoba in that area, and European, mainly French and Scottish. And I know most people think of Métis as only French, but it's not true. There's on L'Oreal's council, there were 6 French, and there were also 6 that were British background. He actually had 3, I think they were of Irish. There was 1 English, that was my ancestor that was on there, Thomas Bunn. He had a Scotsman, and he had a Welshman on his council. So he wanted everybody to be represented, so that, just so you guys know, right? And we have some stories, like I said, that are the same because they're cousins, but then we have very specific differences as well. So let's talk about the literary breakdown of stories, right? Because I'm guessing you guys, if you're especially here for storytelling, either English teachers or you're working in this area or you're just really interested. I do have an English degree from University of Winnipeg as well, so that's definitely something I was always interested in, writing, and I love to write. So here's kind of the breakdown, right? There's symbolic ones. And, we talk about that. We talk about there's lessons to learn. There's instructions from spirit mentors. And sometimes those stories come as, like I said, as a dream, or it could be through a spirit walk, a fast of 4 days in a sweat lodge or something like that, or way back in the day when people were sent off on their own. There are some groups that did that. I don't know if that was common for Cree, but especially young men, sometimes in some cultures, would go off on their own for however long it took them to come back with their own spirit name and sometimes instructions for different things in the culture. They often describe natural processes. You've probably seen a lot of those explaining how things exist and why they exist. Survival accounts, right? And those are really important because that would help, young men, particularly, with hunting and gathering. And then for Métis later, those farming stories about how to collect and prepare and eat foods as well. So those are stories that are passed down because we didn't have recipe books. We didn't have, instructional books for doing this. It was all oral. And then those oral maps for traveling, really important because, there were markers and different things, and maybe, trees that were bent to grow a certain way, or especially in the north for the Inuit, they had, markers as well there. But the stories were told over and over again so that you'd understand where you needed to go and how to get to some place to trade or how you'd survive or places to hunt. And then there's those magical tales of transformation, right? Where there's that mystery and complexity of being human, kind of explaining some of the human condition in a kind of a supernatural kind of way. And then there's lots of adventures in love, romance, and marriage too. Those types of stories, you probably don't see those as much, especially for schools, but they definitely exist. We're going to start with First Nations stories first, right? And those are the ones that have the majority that are available right now as well. They can exist from the sacred to the historical. Some focus on social, political, culture, entertaining, even humorous. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people have the best sense of humor, I have to say. I'm just going to be biased here. Hilarious people. Great sense of humor. Love to laugh about everything, because if you can't laugh about everything, you can't exist. You can't survive, right? So very funny. Some of these, of course, are personal, family, community, or entire nation's experiences that are passed down from generation to generation. And like I said, some are owned by family or clan, or only can be told by members of that group. And others are some you can tell, and anybody can tell those stories, right? Those are the ones you guys are looking for. They often, reflect the perceptions, relationships, beliefs, and attitudes of a particular people as well. So that's important to know when you're reading these stories and the differences in cultures. And even within the Cree culture, which is the largest across Canada, the Dene are the largest across Turtle Island, across the entire swath of this, land. But man, they differ greatly from one area to another, and even close by each other, they can differ. So we'll start with sacred stories. There's no definitive, and I want to say it's a prominent Aboriginal religion. So people often ask about that, right? There's sacred stories in terms of learning symbols or animals used in particular events. They do have similar storylines and sacred events that would be considered that characteristic of religion based on the theme of natural wonder and animism, right? We have, if you follow stories from the Old Testament, if you look at those, and even the New Testament, some of these stories, right, that are things that are considered miracles and wonders and things like that, and they also occur within Indigenous stories. The main two of these stories, of the sacred ones, are creation stories and Trickster and other stories. So you'll see that picture that I have there is that's Turtle Island that we live on, and the turtle is the one that this entire land has been built on. And you'll also note too that the turtle is the calendar, right? So the calendar has the turtle around the edge of the turtle's shell, has those 13 moons. And then within there, there's always divided up into 28 as the 28 days of, the moon cycle. So, interestingly enough, as things go, right? So it's an interesting fact about turtles, right? And the calendar, and how the turtle, it carries the entirety of Turtle Island as well. So for creation stories, they remember their origins through oral histories passed down by elders in each generation. These narratives describe the creation of the world and how First Nations came to live within it. They're more than legends, because what they do is they really explain the worldview of Indigenous peoples as well, in terms of how humans should be behaving on this planet. And then some oral stories refer to a time before there were even humans here, right? Some mark significant geographical, spiritual, and life events. I do want to, at this point, explain to you why this presentation was so important to me. I'm going to tell you just a little story of mine. I was tutoring a student. He was a high school student, ESL, probably just almost a year ago. And anyways, his teacher in the school that he was at, it would have been in the Northwest. I don't know the school in Calgary, is not really that I'm going to call anybody out because I understand teachers are busy and it's hard to find work. And I don't know how long this teacher had been teaching either. But they had pulled up uh, just an exercise that they had found online, and it was obviously American because it said Native American, which is fine, that's okay. But the title of it was Native American Animal Myths and Legends. Okay, so I had a problem right away because what is considered a myth or a legend to someone else is not considered a myth or a legend to Indigenous peoples. These stories, as you can see, they do contain information that explains the natural world around them. And whether you believe or not that all things exist and have life that are animated is not up for you to decide. Because, and I explain this to people this way, I grew up in the church, in the United Church, and I went to church most of my life, and I have no problem with that because it's Indigenous practice for spiritual practice. Everyone's on their own journey and everybody goes their own way, and as long as you're fulfilled with that, that's cool, right? We're fine, like everybody's fine with everybody doing their own thing. But if I was to say to somebody who was a practicing Christian that the stories of Jesus were stories, they were myths, they were just legends, there would be a problem. There would be a big problem because now you're calling into question somebody's actual faith. And so that's where I kind of do an equation to kind of show people where that is, right? Anyways, so I always tell people, call them stories, not myths or legend, just call them stories. If you're uncomfortable, with some of the ideas or the concepts that are in them, that's fine. You don't have to be comfortable with them and you don't have to believe them. But just call them stories. That's, to me, that's why I call them creation stories and not myths or legends too. So there's I've included some links as well for you guys, and I won't have time to go through all of them, and you're welcome because you will get a copy of the links as well as the recording to go through some of them. Now I am going to just pop here and kind of show you, a lot of these are YouTube links as well, and this is from Tribal Trade, and I'm gonna pause it anyway. No, it's probably gonna try to play. Anyways, this lady's Ojibwe. And
how was our
really
Mother
awesome.
Earth created? How did the world and life begin? And why do we say Mother Earth? Watch this video for the original creation.
Look in the chat. Okay. Okay, so Louise in the chat says, this is so interesting. I wish she has to sign off, but that's okay. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So I do have, like I said, I have some videos in here of creation stories. There's also the legend of Wissajack, about how North America came to be as well, which is a really cool story. Just so you guys have some, stories of creation. I put a Mohawk creation story in here as well. You can find others for sure. And that's actually a TEDx talk from Penticton, which is interesting in Mohawk territories in the East, but but that's okay. Because I do want to leave a little bit of time at the end as well to have some time to talk if you guys have questions. So tricksters. So tricksters are a huge part of Indigenous culture and stories, and not just stories, but like when we talk about different things, for instance, there's the little people, there's the backwards people, there's tricksters, there are those spirits. They're not necessarily called evil spirits, but tricksters are kind of under that kind of thing, because there's not evil and good in Indigenous spirituality. There's trying to find balance in everything that's about us, right? So if I don't blame myself for having, proclivity necessarily for, doing something that other people consider bad. What I need to do is bring that into balance. So I'm using that aspect of myself for good, balance it out. Because there's times we need to do things. For instance, people go to war. There's wars, unfortunately, even going on in this world right now, which are terrible. But, if I go do that, am I a horrible, terrible person? Am I behaving like that my entire life? No, I'm not doing that my entire life. But there's times where I need to be a warrior. And that is a fact, right? That happens within all cultures. And so, I don't consider that to be a horrible, evil thing necessarily, depending on what happens, right? But it is used to describe a supernatural figure, and it appears in various cultures around the world. So you'll hear about this in different cultures, but Indigenous people call tricksters by different names. So there's Glooskap, which is Algonquin. There's Wisijak, or as you can see, Wisagijak, Wisagijak, which is in Cree. I'm probably butchering that one. I didn't learn that one, but I think because that's spelled out phonetically. So I'm trying to pronounce it like my elders. And then Nana Bush or Nana Bozo, which is Anishinaabe or Ojibwe. And I actually did during COVID, the pandemic, rather than want to say, was teaching some kids at school, and it was a small group of homeschool kids that came in for one of our programs at a private school, and we actually did it in the gym. Everybody wearing masks. It was horribly hard and separated from each other, but we actually did, basically reading it out almost like a radio play together, but doing it was the best I could come up with at that time to get the kids to do it. But they actually rewrote it themselves and tried to figure out how they would like to do it. But they took that story of Nana Bozu. Anyways, tricksters are also credited with protecting humans sometimes, right? Tricking others into protecting. So like, again, there's not necessarily evil all the time. Sometimes they do things to help. They're also associated with rule breaking. So sometimes when you want to talk about that, kind of being in that teenage kind of era and you're just learning things. So a lot of times for, that age group, they'll learn a lot about that, about the rule breaking. And then they want to cross and challenge boundaries, right? So if you want to challenge something in your culture, you'll talk about tricksters. They also ignore social harmony and order. So they like to throw things and wrench into things. And they're also told to entertain and talk about morality and, how should we behave properly. I also have some good ones here for you. I'm not going to play this for you because it is very long, but APTN did actually an entire episode devoted to tricksters, shapeshifters, star people, and other Indigenous legends. And I think it was at Halloween time one year. But I put a link to this as well on here just to, it was around Halloween, just to explain things. It's interesting, I guess, APTN also has a show called Indians and Aliens, which is interesting too, talking about that, just because going back to that idea that Indigenous peoples, call themselves the star people as well, right? They come from the stars. So First Nations will say that. There's also First Nations people here that say that they've always lived here, that they didn't, come from somewhere else, that they've always lived here. And so it is interesting, especially when you think about the fact that it's Wyoming, the largest medicine wheel exists there, and they cannot date it. As far as they know, it's millions of years old. So that's something to think about when they say that. Anyways, just I put a couple of other links in here for you as well. And a Coyote and Raven, American Tricksters, because those are the two that I always heard about when I was a kid. Coyote and Raven were always the tricksters in the stories that I grew up hearing. And that'll kind of give you just a bit of a crash course in that world mythology in regard to those couple of characters. Talk about generational knowledge, right? So these stories also pass on family histories and clan histories. Like I said, a lot of the time that's how they remembered their entire family lineage. And you would often have a name would be passed down as well, right? So a child would be born and they would be named after an ancestor. And that was to pass on that family lineage. And also, if you've got to remember how many generations going back in stories, if you keep the same similar names, then that also helps too, right? So there was some benefit to that too. A lot of that, of course, was lost then during, disposition, pistomicide, taking people off their land, and obviously residential schools. And then we're talking about the foster system. So a lot of breaking down of family systems has occurred, unfortunately, in this country. And so some of that information has been lost, unfortunately. So trying to get back some of those family stories is really important. And as you'll notice, I've gotten their often naming ceremonies for babies would include the story of how that child would receive their name. And again, that's a story, if that name has been passed down for generation to generation to generation, that same story is passed down, and that's how you remember. Character education is really important as well, right? So we think of the 7 grandfather teachings or the 7 sacred teachings, probably the most well-known one here in Canada and used pretty much across Turtle Island now, because the Cree have similar teachings, not exactly the same when they don't use the animals necessarily, but this is a great visual, especially for teaching kids with animals to do that. I've included a link for the reading of the 7 sacred teachings. This is a link, and again, I'm not going to get into this because I do a whole separate presentation just on the 7 grandfathers. I worked with Edmonton SPCA to create these resources for grades 1 to 2 and 3 to 6 based on, because it's animals, in the 7 grandfather teachings, that has a teacher booklet and activity booklet for each one for character education. So that's something you can take a look at if those in fact are your grade levels. I have talked to them about working on something for junior high. We haven't got to there yet, but we're talking about that as well. And then I am going to show you, this is super short, it's only 3 minutes and 33 seconds or so, of this story. If you know the story about the 2 wolves, this is the real story of the 2 wolves. I'm trying to figure out why I'm not getting any sound. I'm going to turn this, see if I can get the sound going.
Many of us have heard the Native American story of the 2 wolves. What we were not told, however, is that the modern version going around on the internet is not the original story that is passed down through Native American tribes. The original story is much different, fundamentally so, even in the lessons it teaches. This is the internet version you may have heard. An old Cherokee is teaching his grandson about life. "A fight is going on inside me," he said to the boy. "It is a terrible fight, and it is between 2 wolves. One is evil. He is anger, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego." He continued, "The other is good. He is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. The same fight is going on inside of you, and inside of every other person too." The grandson thought about it for a minute, and then asked his grandfather, "Which wolf will win?" You might have heard the modern censored internet story ending like this. The old Cherokee simply replied, "The one you feed." In the Cherokee world, however, and in the original story of the 2 wolves that has been passed down through Native American tribes, the story ends this way. The old Cherokee simply replied, "If you feed them right, they both win," and the story goes on. "You see, if I only choose to feed the white wolf, the black one will be hiding around every corner waiting for me to become distracted or weak and jump to get the attention he craves. He will always be angry and always fighting the white wolf. But if I acknowledge him, he is happy, and the white wolf is happy, and we all win. For the black wolf has many qualities: tenacity, courage, fearlessness, strong-willed, and great strategic thinking that I have need of at times, and that the white wolf lacks. But the white wolf has compassion, caring, strength, and the ability to recognize what is in the best interest of all. You see, son, the white wolf needs the black wolf at his side. To feed only one would starve the other, and they will soon become uncontrollable. To feed and care for both means they will serve you well and do nothing that is not a part of something greater, something good, something of life. Feed them both, and there will be no more internal struggle for your attention. And when there is no battle inside, you can listen to the voices of deeper knowing that will guide you in choosing what is right in every circumstance. Peace, my son, is the Cherokee mission in life. A man or woman who has peace inside has everything. A man or woman who is pulled apart by the war inside him or her has nothing. How you choose to interact with the opposing forces within you will determine your life. Starve one or the other, or guide them both. This is the original story of the 2 wolves. Spread the message.
So, as you can see, it's that idea, right, where we need balance. And so that is, if you think of the medicine wheel, if you think of a sharing circle, I think all those things, everything in a circle and everything in balance and interconnectedness. That's that idea, right? And the other idea too in this story is that there is no specific outcome that you get to choose, right? You have to do this work. And in a spiritual sense of it, we always, like what I'm taught, my teaching that I've received is that if I do 50% of the work, Creator will do the other 50%. And that means that I have to be actively doing this. I can't just pray and ask for something like healing for something, or, that I want something in my life if I'm not going to do the work myself. It's that idea that, my family always said that, right, is that, God helps those who help themselves, that idea. And it's very much that idea is that, you can sit there and ask for something, and that's idea of the people praying for something and they don't actually get up off their stuffs and do it, right? And so again, so it's like that, but it's also open-ended, which is really important, because it's about teaching children from the time they're really little until they're adults that they have to make decisions for themselves and they need to make responsible decisions. So it's really a part of Indigenous culture that it's important for you to understand that. I have included some links here as well. Again, I don't have time to go through all of them, but the NFB, it has lots of stuff. Sharing Through Story, which is on empowering the spirit. I've included some Indigenous resource lists for you as well for Indigenous First Nations books and other Indigenous book lists as well. The time remaining, which isn't too much, I'm going to just touch on Métis stories and the Inuit stories as well. And I have to say, I don't know as much about Inuit culture as I would like. I do have friends here in Calgary that are Inuit, and they are teaching me more stuff, and I'm very grateful to them. And I actually said I want to interview them next year, possibly for doing a session, which would be really awesome. Anyways, with that, storytelling for Métis is different, right? Because although people did live in teepees and trapper huts while they were hunting bison a lot of the time, they also had stationary homes, right? Old homesteads is what we called my grandpa's families. It was an old log home basically, right? But they had homes that were stationary. But people would stay in the winter just like they would in teepees, and they would tell their stories. Some of these stories went on for days though. Like if somebody got a hold of it, it's like the elders, right? If somebody got a hold of the storytelling, they could be there for a very long time. They also involved generally fiddling and singing and lots of food, lots of bannock, lots of fish fries, all that kind of stuff all together. So our stories are a little bit different that way. It's more like a sitting gathering, more of a party type atmosphere as well at the time. Like I said, there are different ways of telling stories. Sometimes you would get up and they recite really long stories, so things that were memorized again, so they were oral stories that were passed on. They would almost sing or chant them sometimes. And then there were some, like I said, they played fiddles, and they were part of fiddle dances and incorporated them. Again, they also taught about laws and taught how we should live good lives. So that was really important to understand as well for Métis people. I did include some, again, some stuff for, Métis books. So some things on the Gabrielle Dumont Institute website, as well as a couple of other areas where there's some other books and picture books for the Métis and some other books there as well. And then for the Inuit, like I said, well, obviously storytelling is very important for the Inuit. I mean, I grew up hearing these all the time. My adopted grandfather was assistant commissioner in the Northwest Territories for a number of years until he became very ill with heart disease. And I went to Yellowknife as a child, spent time there. I had all kinds of stuff from Yellowknife. It was constantly sent to me, toys and books, all kinds of stuff. So I love Inuit culture. And anyway, so I grew up hearing these stories and reading these stories. I got so many books. I love them. There's amazing, the ideas in these stories, right? And thinking of these people that were living in this place that had no trees, and it was all ice during the winter. The good part of the year was ice, and they lived in igloos. But traditionally it was crazy, right? I just thought this was amazing. But it was the elders, the grandfathers, the grandmothers, and parents would share these stories with the children, and not only to entertain them. It was really important within Inuit stories is it's to teach them about the land, the sea, and their culture, especially to make sure they were safe, right? So they have some pretty scary stories in Inuit culture, if you've ever seen any, about scaring the children away from the ice and from if there was any breaks in the ice and the water, that there were these great spirits that would come and take the children and steal them, right? I cannot do justice in pronouncing these names, so I'm not even going to try to butcher them. But really important because you're living in a very harsh environment. And so you had to have a lot of these stories. So, and it's really important too. And I have a link here, and I'm not going to open it now just for time wise, but I encourage you to read the one that says storytelling instead of scolding, because the Inuit have this amazing way, traditional way of raising children. That way that we're coming around to now, and in our culture where like that whole idea of spare the rod, spoil the child is not part of their culture at all, right? They not hitting children, they really listen to the children. They use storytelling for almost everything traditionally to get the kids to listen, to explain things to them in this very gentle manner. And it's just amazing. When I read this article, I thought it's what everybody here really aspires to in terms of Western culture now, in terms of raising children, but to raise them as well to be these really responsible, thoughtful people. I thought this is a very loving way to do things. It's really cool. And then I also included a link for Inuit storytelling with Michael Kusagak, who partnered you know, he did that story. I can't remember the, I should open it and I'll just take a peek because then I'll remember the name of the story. Sorry, this is a link for him doing a talk about his culture and just his writing and that sort of thing, and just talking about the Inuit people in general. So there's that, but I can't remember the exact story, but I know I've used it with kids before when I've been in schools. So anyways, I did get to there. I did leave 10 minutes at the end. I'm amazed I did it. But I'm going to stop sharing that, and then I'm going to stop recording. So if anybody does want to